Alrighty, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to our webinar about grants and agreements, people and processes. This is the third in a series about Forest Service grants, agreements, and partnerships. My name is Emery Cowan. I pronouns she, her, and I work with the Watershed Research and Training Center and the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. And I will be moderating today's session, so thank you all for coming. We're going to go over a few Zoom reminders. Similar to our prior sessions, we are going to have the chat box turned off for attendees to be able to chat with everyone, but we do have it turned on for you all to chat with our hosts and panelists. If you have needs, feel free to get in touch via the chat box. We will also be sharing resources out via the chat. And unfortunately, we learned that we can't do copy paste, but those hyperlinks should be clickable, and we will be sending out all resources that we share in a follow-up email. We will have some Q&A time at the end of this session, so feel free to use that Q&A box to drop in questions for our panelists at any point throughout our discussion today. We also have interpretation, both ASL and Spanish language interpretation available. So you can access that via that little interpretation icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And that's also where you'll find closed captioning in that bar. Lastly, we will be recording this session and sending it out via email to all everyone who registered for this session. So no worries if you have to drip out earlier. If you know someone who wanted to come but couldn't make it, we'll make that widely available. We'll also be posting it on our website and on our YouTube channels. So just a quick overview of where we've been so far with this series. Again, this is the third in a three-part series aimed at giving a basic understanding of Forest Service, the Forest Service as an agency, as well as the financial tools it uses to work with partners, including through competitive grant programs and non-competitive partnership agreements and other agreements. The first session was a couple of weeks ago that introduced the agency, its scope of work, structure, and some of the important policy and budgetary drivers that influence its work with partners. The second webinar, which was last week, focused in on this universe of grants and agreements tools, kind of orienting people to what the forest is working with in terms of funding instruments and some of their important functions and features, as well as a great update and overview of the agency's 2022 match waiver and reduction policy. So that's a good session to tune into if you have questions about that. We also had a great question and answer session that kind of dug into the details. This third session aims to kind of tie everything together with a panel of Forest Service staff, as well as nonprofit leaders who are going to talk about what it looks like to be putting these grants and agreements tools into practice, what it looks like to kind of move an idea into a formal grant or agreement project, who gets involved and when, and some of the watchouts and lessons learned that we'll have our panelists share from their extensive experience with these tools. So again, if you missed any of those prior two sessions, those are available at our trainings landing page, and my colleague David is putting that into the chat box. Alrighty, this webinar is made possible thanks to our organization's involvement in the Forest Service's Community Navigator Initiative. This was kicked off last year in 2023 to support communities that have been historically underserved to better find and access Forest Service funding and partnership opportunities, with the goal of promoting more equitable distribution of some of the major climate and wildfire risk reduction infrastructure investments that have come down from Congress in the past couple of years. We have 6 organizations that are all partnering in this initiative. Those are all listed on the right of this slide. as well as several community navigator, Forest Service community navigator staff. So we're all kind of working together to be providing comprehensive wraparound services to communities in a lot of different ways. We're sharing links to all of those partner organizations and overall Forest Service landing page in the chat if you're interested in checking that any of that out more. In terms of the services we provide, that falls into 3 general buckets. We provide one-on-one support, so working with organizations, individuals on identifying, exploring and identifying different potential funding opportunities or partnership opportunities. We also work on proposal development and post-award implementation. Another pillar of our work really focuses more broadly on program development support, so connecting people with people, networks, sources of expertise that can help organizations that are looking to start or grow their wildfire or climate resilience work. And then we also have a capacity building bucket of our work that includes trainings like this one, as well as resource development, a monthly newsletter of different funding opportunities and kind of insights around federal programs and processes, and then resource and funding compilations that are all available on our website. And again, that I think David's throwing that link in the chat box. So feel free to get in touch if any of this is of interest or you know someone who might benefit. Okay, so turning to today's webinar, most of our time will be dedicated to hearing from our awesome group of panelists. Again, we have 3 panelists who work with the Forest Service. We have Midori Raymore, who is with the Office of Grants and Agreements in State, Private, and Tribal Forestry with the Forest Service's Eastern Region. We have Gina Knudsen, Partnership Coordinator with the Salmon Chalice National Forest in Idaho, and Mike Ward with the Forest Service's Southern Region based out of North Carolina. On the nonprofit side of things, we'll be joined by Nick Goulet with the Watershed Research and Training Center in California, Jay McLaughlin with the Mount Adams Resource Stewards in Washington, and Eitan Kreslovsky with the Forest Stewards Guild in New Mexico. So all of these folks have kind of really deep experience with grants and agreements and complementary perspectives that we'll be looking forward to diving into. I do want to note that Nick, Jay, and Eitan, both individually and their organizations and staffs, are really involved in our Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network and our family of fire networks, and are really great sources of wisdom and experience that they contribute to those networks. And that's a real value and asset that we're excited to bring into the community navigator space, is some of the institutional knowledge and experience that these folks can add and bring. So without further ado, I will stop my screen share and have all of our panelists join me on screen, and we'll dive into the discussion. So Midori, Eitan, Nick, hopefully have you joining on. Awesome. Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Good to see you all today. So we are going to use this time, first of all, to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what these grants and agreements processes look like and how different people who are in different roles engage with them. So we're going to start off with our Forest Service panelists. Kick it over to you, Gina. The first question is just remind us of your role, how it interfaces with grants and agreements processes, and if you could choose one example to kind of run through in terms of what this grant or agreement process looks like from your perspective. Turn it over to you.
So Thank you again for putting this on. I think this is a really important subject. I kind of have always considered myself a community navigator. So I came from the nonprofit world before I joined the Forest Service, and I became a partnership coordinator in 2019. So I've done it for about 5 years. So a little bit ahead of the large batch of partnership coordinators that were hired throughout the agency just a couple of years ago. And sort of that my interest in this job was kind of that adage of being the change you wish to see in the world. Sorry, Gandhi. But when I was in the nonprofit world, I definitely wished that I had someone on my local Forest Service unit who understood a little bit more about our organization and how we might really be a help to the agency. And so I really enjoy my job now. It's kind of a dream job. And what I like about it is I'm able to be kind of that relationship manager and able to reach out to both new and existing partners and really dive in on what strengths they're bringing to our area, how they might match up with some of the initiatives we have on the forest, and especially how they might match up with some funding. And so, given what some people are considering a once in a lifetime investment in the Forest Service in recent years, it's really important that we show accomplishments. We spent a lot of decades in the agency not having enough funding to accomplish things. And now that we do, we really can't squander that. And that means we're going to have to work with everyone, and we're going to have to do it in ways that we haven't worked together before. So some of the ways that I work with partners to make that happen is I believe in networks. I'm fortunate to know Jay and Nick through some of, and Aton through some of my previous networks. And that was always the most inspirational work I could do is, hearing from other groups about what they were able to get done. And then sometimes pushing the elephant up the hill in my own region to try to do something similar. And I think they probably had experiences like that too, where we heard about one group and one forest who was able to do something, and we were inspired by that and able to work differently together. So, so the first thing I have to do before we go to grants and agreements, is, especially with a new partner, is really understand what that partner is bringing to the table. And there could be things that a group brings that we really need. For instance, right now, at least my forest has a shortage of vehicles. And so if I am talking to a partner who happens to have a fleet of vehicles, that helps people get out in the field. And I really need to know about that. The other thing that I think we all struggle with is housing. And, recently I was able to work with a intern group out of a university that happens to have housing in my area that they were able to access. So that helps me solve a problem. It helps the partner solve a problem. But I really just need to understand everything you're bringing to the table, and then really what drives you to be interested in working on public lands. And then, the next thing I'll do is make sure that there's a program person on the forest that kind of shares that passion. The last thing I want to do is have a partner try to work with someone who's, not really in a place where partnership work makes sense for them. And usually that has to do with being understaffed and just not knowing how you're going to supervise a crew or supervise, provide that mentorship that really makes a partnership great. So, when we talk about examples of that, we've worked with one local organization, happens to be the local organization I used to be affiliated with. They've been able to hire staff. I should call out that's Salmon Valley Stewardship here in Salmon, Idaho. But they've been able to hire year-round staff with some funding that they got from the National Forest Foundation to help us do reforestation surveys. And what that has enabled us to do, the Salmon Chalice, is say yes to an opportunity with the National Community Conservation Corps Forest Corps program. We didn't have the personnel in place to be able to go out and show them how to do regeneration surveys, but Salmon Valley Stewardship did have that employee in place. So those are ways that we can create a proposal that goes to grants and agreements that's based on specific information about what I know about the partner, what I know about the forest needs. And so I feel like that's been a very effective way to be able to match up some of these new opportunities with the existing conditions in our community and out there on the forest. And then once I understand that better, then I can help the partner be able to put together a package that really speaks to the needs that grants and agreements has. And, you know, usually with a few conversations with the right people in place, you can create a pretty elegant scope of work that encompasses all those things that partners bring into the table. So match. And when I say match, you know, things like the housing and the vehicles or even workspace, you know, very valuable. Recruiting networks, very valuable. We find a way to capture that. And then also, you know, make sure that that narrative matches up with the financial plans. So I've found that when you have those really robust conversations, then the grants and agreements forms are not as difficult to fill out. And so I'm just going to leave it there because I know my fellow panelists have really great examples as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Gina. And you mentioned program managers and that being a really close interface and relationship. So we have a program manager here, Mike Ward, if you want to jump in and kind of take the conversation from there about what your role is and what it looks like to work through grants and agreements processes with an example. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And thanks for going first, Gina, because she hit on a ton of very similar points from where I come from the fire and aviation management and ecological restoration using fire, like from the fuels program. And my interaction, my job requires me to interact with a lot of cross-boundary partners. For one thing, in our where I'm at, and I know in a lot of places in the Forest Service system and a lot of all the other agencies and private landowners there's no continuous boundary. We're all fragmented and we all share the same landscapes and ecosystems out there and watersheds. So being part of those larger groups of people and organizations that are trying to get similar work done is where we can find a lot of commonality across those landscapes. So because just like with a wildfire or a natural event like that, it doesn't stop at the boundary line. And to get the good work done, we need to reach out there and everybody work together in that bigger holistic watershed, fireshed type scenario. And so recognizing the needs of and the objectives, the goals and objectives of those different perspectives coming in there and what their strengths and weaknesses are of the individual groups. So participating with our local state agencies, the DNRs, the wildlife management, the forestry folks, and the understanding the multiple different mechanisms we can achieve those agreements also. So being familiar with the different tools that are out there. And I've got so many examples, but I guess like one of them is we needed more helicopter aerial ignition time up in the southern Appalachians on the Nantahala National Forest to improve elk habitat for the herds that are up there that were introduced about 20 years ago and are thriving, and we're not keeping up with the habitat needs. So the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation came up to one of our fire management officers at a Ducks Unlimited meeting that they were both at and said, hey, what do we got to do to make this happen? And that's how a lot of these grassroots organic conversations start. And it's we're at a duck meeting, we're talking about elk, and then and it's all around fire. And so and helicopters. So we got Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation actually provided funding to the Forest Service to increase our flight time availability for some of our contract helicopters to get that work done, because that was one of our limiting factors. So that's just like an example there of how just being there and being engaged with everybody on those landscapes and trying to understand where they're coming from too. Reducing potential smoke impacts, type like at a county health department meeting might turn into a region-wide or nationwide agreement for hazardous fuel reduction in smoke-sensitive areas, especially for using the equity and inclusion mappings tools and things like that we have out there now to identify communities at risk, and especially underserved communities. So there's a whole lot of things to consider and opportunities, because a lot of this hinges on funding opportunities. And we were talking about match, and there's different types of agreements that require different amounts of match for one reason or another, the way they're developed. And so just understanding that, working between the programs, between the grants and agreements, the different, so like I work with state and private folks and the timber shop quite a bit, even though we're in different lanes and we both have kind of different objectives. A lot of our work interacts. So leveraging those opportunities too, to work with our partners who have the similar, they want to get the work done. So fire learning networks, prescribed fire coalitions, all of those type groups really have you have an opportunity to meet people and then interact and bring everybody together. So just being that spark plug to tie people together and to keep the enthusiasm going, like, because it gets hard with all the paperwork. So I'm gonna leave it at that, but that's it's very rewarding. I'll say that. I love this kind of work. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And then we'll toss it over to Midori, where the rubber hits the road on the grants and agreements side of things. So same question to you, Midori.
So this is a good segue, because with what Gina is talking about is that creativity of trying to find the partner and the Forest Service in the program and make it all come together for a need or a benefit that exists, right? And then Mike was talking about the furthering of relationships and how those relationships might happen. And when the projects get to grants and agreements, part of our role is to ensure that this really wonderful, lovely project is within the policy and the legality of whatever the authority is that's going to be doing the agreement or funding the agreement. And it's not that we ever want, a grants management specialist would ever want to say, oh, you can't do that, and be a hard stop. It's more that they want to protect both the agency and the partner, because the last thing we would ever want to have happen is for someone to come in and say, well, this wasn't done right, and now somebody has to pay all this money back. That is never a good outcome. So that's our primary role, is to ensure that projects are valid and can move forward, and that they're safe in the sense that they're legal and everything is working together and everything is going to benefit, because ultimately our funding is to benefit the public, not just the Forest Service or not just the landowner or not just the state, but it's ultimately to benefit everyone in the United States that might have access to that property, that resource. That's part of why I love state and private tribal forestry. We're sort of a hidden part of the agency, in the sense that our money comes into the agency and we turn around and send it back out to our state or our nonprofits. In with the new IRA funding, we're even moving directly into landowner assistance type awards. And so we touch a lot of resources that happen in state and private that are not on NFS lands. And so when I see trees being planted in a park or signs up about watershed restoration, oftentimes I know that state forest service and state and private forestry have a part in that project. And it makes me glad to see that type of activity, because I know we're taking taxpayer dollars and putting them to really great benefit for everyone. And so that's part of our role, is just to make sure that all the documents are lined up and everything's working copacetically, and present other ways that might get us to yes if something isn't quite working, because there are constraints policy-wise, legal-wise, on certain funding requirements underneath certain authorities. There are some authorities that the work can only happen on NFS lands. There are other authorities that allow people to cross the boundary and work on both lands, which is some of what Mike was talking about, the hazardous fuels, or underneath a Wyden where you're working on watershed restoration, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation with hazardous fuels removal too, or Wild Turkey Federation, where they're coming in and trying to restore that habitat after a fire or after some type of big event, a derecho that's knocked all the trees down. And they're trying to do some restoration work for habitat improvement. Trying to think, is there more?
I think that's great, Midori, and we can have more discussion when we get into some Q&A and some of our other questions.
Okay.
Awesome, thank you. So we're gonna toss it to Jay, Nick, and Eitan. Similar question, but what does this process look like from the perspective of a nonprofit partner? Again, talk us through an example that will kind of show folks what the process looks like. So Eitan, maybe I'll start off with you, and then Jay and Nick. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Emery. Yeah, so I'm gonna give an example for a youth program that my organization has been running for, I think, 25 years or so. I've personally been with the organization closer to just shy of 20, so it's been a while that I've been here. And we've been doing this youth program in partnership with the Forest Service and some tribes for many years. And as you can imagine, if you're gonna do a youth corps program and have them stationed at Forest Service ranger districts doing work on public lands, there's going to be agreements in place. And so there have been many, like a series of agreements, and they kind of have evolved over time. So, you know, what was totally fine in 2008 wouldn't pass muster now, and that's okay. We kind of, like, everything evolves. And I'll give a snippet of 2018 when some big changes happened to our youth program. So just to set the context, I'm in New Mexico and I'm working with forests in Region 3 and tribes in Region 3. And in 2018, it was a big change because my organization, the Forest Stewards Guild, we had done high school aged youth crews. And we did anywhere between 5 and 8 summer crews. So when the students are on summer break, they get a job and they get paid and they get training, and then they do conservation projects on Forest Service managed lands. But in 2018, we stood up a fall program, and we're going to train them to be red carded and ready to work on fuels projects and prescribed burns. So that involved chainsaws and fire. And that required that we do a fresh 5-year agreement. And so we built in using fire. How is that going to work out when they support a Forest Service burn? we covered chainsaws in the agreement, and because at the same time, the Forest Stewards Guild, we also stood up a program we've been calling, in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, the All Hands All Lands Burn Network, to do prescribed fire on multiple jurisdictions. We needed to have widened authority, so we knew change was coming. We probably were working in 2017 on the agreement so that it was ready to go in 2018. So at least a year of agreement prep. And it worked out, but it wasn't perfect. And one of the things we realized was that we missed the Public Land Corps authority so that the youth could get access to that benefit for future hiring. And so we went back and I think it was 2020, did an amendment, did a new agreement. So we did a 5-year agreement. It lasted 2 years, but realized that the Public Land Corps authority was needed to really both attract people and give them kind of what they deserved for doing all the work and training. And so, you're not going to get everything right the first time. And you gotta keep evaluating. And, like we talk a lot about adaptive management in fire and forestry and watershed management. And I think the same applies with partnerships and agreements. Like you have to reflect on the actual agreement mechanism and the processes and, have good communications with everyone involved, the program people, the grants and agreement specialists, so that you can, find those things that you want to change and work through them socially, and then, make the change in the agreement or make a new agreement.
Take time, go for it, Jay.
All right. Thanks again for inviting me to be a part of the conversation. And again, my name is Jay McLaughlin. I direct Mount Adams Resource Stewards, and we're a community forestry organization based in Klickitat County, Washington. I guess by way of a little bit of context, we haven't been around as long as the Forest Stewards Guild or the Watershed Center, and have learned a lot from them through the years. And we have experienced a lot of growth. Being in a very rural, low population part of Washington state, we've expanded significantly over the past 6 or 7 years, and in many ways in response to needs and interests of our partners, and in particular the U.S. Forest Service. We're celebrating our 20th year as an organization this year, and yet it wasn't until about 6 or 7 years ago that we really started ramping up our staffing with field crews, and other programmatic expansions to be able to respond to those needs. And so today we've got 25 folks on staff. 9 of those are permanent employees. And that involves at any given time us managing on average about 60 different agreements. And of those 60 agreements, I was just looking at our list this morning. Currently, we have 8 active agreements for the Forest Service. So, roughly $10 million in committed funding there, and the Forest Service's piece makes up about $1.1 million of those committed funds. So about 10%, you could say, of our work budgetarily. Maybe a little bit more than that as far as just the sheer number of agreements that we have. Historically, we've used 3 different agreement mechanisms to get work done with the Forest Service. Initially, we undertook a lot of challenge cost share agreements. Seemed like a pretty straightforward tool, helped us get people on the ground and get good work done. And maybe the biggest challenge was just working to the minutia of the financial worksheets, as anybody that's done them can imagine. We also have utilized stewardship agreements, and we're a sponsor for the collaborative group that's active in our part of the Northwest, the South Gifford Pinchot Collaborative. And so that's been a mechanism that has helped fund some work there, but we've also used it on very field specific project type work. And most recently, it was last year that we signed our first master participating agreement, and I wanted to speak a little bit to that. That was something that, as I would pick Nick Goulette's brain through the years as to how they got good things done down in Northern California, he would share examples of. And yet, at a very local level, at the Mount Adams Ranger District level, we often had conversations about, what's the utility of something like that? How is it going to help us get work done? And ultimately, we ended up bringing a master participating agreement forward in response to liability concerns as far as involving our field staff on prescribed burns on National Forest System lands. And it ended up from there growing into a tri-forest master participating agreement between the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, the Columbia Gorge National Scenic Area, and the Mount Hood National Forest and our organization. Again, probably the greatest excitement about it was, hey, we don't have to worry about liability coverage in terms of inviting Mount Adams resource steward staff out on prescribed burns for the first time this year. So that was established in 2023 for us. This is the first year we've actually had a supplemental project agreement established under that MPA, that master participating agreement, and small dollar supplemental project agreement. Several $1,000s just to bring our crew out to get some hand line constructed around a prescribed burn unit that we're hoping to implement this fall. But it's encouraging and exciting or intriguing to us just in terms of the potential to be able to expand on that and utilize that in more and more places and addressing more and more needs for our partners. Hopefully that's helpful as a start.
That's a great start, Jay. And I'm just putting in the chat box a few resources to help explain. Oh, shoot, I didn't do it to everyone. I'm going to put in the chat box a few resources to kind of help explain some of those agreements that, Jay, you were referencing. I'll turn it over to you, Nick, what this process looks like from your vantage point. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. Great kickoff on this. For additional context on the Watershed Center, we've been working with the agency through various cooperative agreements and grants for almost 30 years now. Or maybe we're over 30 years. Time flies. Partnership agreements, challenge cost share agreements, stewardship agreements, and then grants that come through state and private forestry. And I thought I'd reflect a little bit on the grant side of it, because I think it's interesting and somewhat different than the cooperative agreement side of the sort of two tool sets. The National Forest System doesn't have granting authority, so any grant is going to run through state and private forestry. National Forest System really relies on cooperative agreements, and we've talked some about a number of those. And there's some similarities and differences in sort of what the process looks like for ginning these up, and then the engagement and the administration I thought I'd just reflect on. And the offerings of grants have been, pretty limited historically. Sometimes they come and go with Congress authorizing new programs and money, and then those sunset and don't get reauthorized. Much less sort of discretionary sort of spending within the Forest Service, right? Cooperative agreements, a lot of times they'll happen between a local forest and a nonprofit, or a region and a nonprofit, and they can bundle lots of different kinds of money together to sort of do cooperative agreement work. Grants are usually this sort of program that Congress has specifically authorized, that the Forest Service makes rules around, and then competes. And so many of you are probably seeing, if you're in the nonprofit world, seeing more grant opportunities because of this bill and IRA money that's created things like community wildfire defense grants. So, right off the bat, there's this sort of difference in the, relationship towards the money, right? You're not sort of working with a partner on the forest to sort of negotiate a project per se. You might have a shared project idea, but then you're going into this open competition process to actually go after and try to bring that money home. And so there's probably a local partnership or regional partnership kind of context to your grant work. But then if you're going to go after a community wildfire defense grant, you're sort of then casting out on your own into that competitive world. And then who you're meeting on the other side of it. So say you're then awarded a community wildfire defense grant, is a set of administrators who aren't your local partners and aren't your local grants and agreements or regional or province grants and agreements staff. And so you're much less likely to know those people personally. You're much less likely to have sort of the ability to have a relationship with them. And so, how do you orient towards that? And we've been going through this process with community wildfire defense grants. We were fortunate to get a couple of awards in the first round, 2 years ago, I think. And I think, a couple things struck us about the process that are worth just thinking about as you head in that direction. First off, again, the less personal kind of nature of that in terms of, are you leaning on relationships? Are you building relationships that you're going to leverage into lots of future work, right? You're sort of setting the wheels in motion in a partnership that you're going to continue leaning on over time. A lot of times with cooperative agreements, that's the way to go into it. And that's how it'll play out. And you'll build momentum around that and have kind of repeated experiences together. This grant process, a lot of times it's going to be a one-off. Maybe you get to work with that administrator again, but you're not likely to start with any rapport. And so you want to go into it eyes wide open. You want to know that you're in an administrative process that's a little different than your grant typical sort of agreements process. And then I think something we experienced as well was just community wildfire defense grants as an example. Big program, new program, lots of expectation, really high level of top level agency administrator and congressional interest and kind of accountability and performance. And so the level of scrutiny around interpreting Code of Federal Regulations, which Midori, of course, does all the time, but how the Washington office is thinking about what's allowable, how they want you to account for things, what's going to go in a financial plan, it looks a little different. And, so we've actually had a bit of a protracted process kind of going from what we know really well and we do all the time, under multiple agreements over generations now with the agency and what the Washington office is sort of expecting. So it's been a process. We've had to build in more time. We've had to sort of take a look back at how we've done things in the past and think about whether that aligns with what might be a new way of doing business or might just be how business is going to be done under community wildfire defense grants. And so we've had a lot of internal then kind of discussions and thinking about, do we want to change how we're doing our agreements to align with this, or is this going to be a one-off? How do we sort of balance the accountability expectations that we think are going to be existing between a more run-of-the-mill agreement and, a big and, high-profile community wildfire defense grant? So I think I just wanted to offer some of that reflection on, what we've been experiencing there and some of what you might all expect to experience if you're now getting into that funding cycle. And I think that's true for the other grant programs as well, just kind of recognizing National Forest System, state and private forestry. There's rules around agreements and rules around grants. There's interpretations of the CFRs that could look different, and be prepared for that administrative burden. And just as with any, I think, agreement process and just engagement with the Forest Service, like be prepared to walk through it stepwise, ask lots of questions, be curious. When you have something that's a bottom line issue for you, be prepared to kind of advocate for that and figure out how to find that sweet spot that can make it work. As Midori talked about, like there's usually a way to make it work, but there's a lot of compliance rules in here. Be prepared to have different people see them different ways and be prepared to sort of shift how you're showing up as a partner based upon that.
Thanks, Nick. Saw a lot of nodding heads on that. Just want to give kind of a shout out to some of our prior sessions. We talked about a lot of these different tools and some of the different dynamics associated with them. So that was a great kind of reflection, Nick, and putting this into context of community wildfire defense grant as one example. But just I was taking notes on like not only the difference between these tools, but the different relationships and how they're approached is just important for partners to know if you have a lot of experience with one type of agreement tool and grants being a pretty different context. kind of spinning off of where you were going, wanted to toss kind of maybe one discussion question to the group before we transition to question and answer. Maybe we'll get to two. But in terms of the fact that these tools, especially on the agreement side of things, might involve different people and different approaches depending on the project context, who's involved, what region you're working in. They often have different processes. How could people just reflect on like what are some strategies or just advice or lessons learned on getting to that yes, and kind of navigating the fact that there's no one playbook for this. So how should partners be kind of going into this process, knowing that specificity and kind of the details are important, but also it's going to be a little bit of navigation on both sides of things. Does anyone want to kick us off with that? Midori?
You're unmuting myself. That's a really good question. And one of the things I would advocate for anyone, especially new to an agreement, new to a project, maybe new to a grant even, is asking who that specialist, who that grants management specialist might be. Ask your partner coordinator or your program manager, who is the person who's going to be putting together the agreement or the grant. Can we have that pre-award meeting? Because it would behoove, especially a new partner, to ask for that and say, can we bring those people to a meeting? Can we involve them earlier? Just so that everyone is hearing the same thing earlier in the process rather than later. Sometimes that takes a little bit more coordination because grants management specialists at certain times of the year, like right now, is a very extremely busy time of year for any, because we're trying to obligate all the funds. Earlier in the year, it's a little easier when you're doing that planning process, which might take place earlier in the federal fiscal year, which runs October to September. And I did want to point out that Nick, you made a really great point. One of the reasons why a grant is so different for partners is the partner is responsible for how that grant works and what they do with that money, and not so much the agency peering over their shoulders so often. We give you the money and say, you go do all the work. And you kind of have, within the boundaries, the ability to make your own decisions about how that work happens. It's the biggest difference between an agreement and a grant. I think someone else should jump in if they have advice about.
Well, yeah, start early. So if you're just now meeting up with somebody and saying, hey, that's a great idea, let's get these crews together and restore turkey habitat on the side of this mountain. That sounds great. You got 3 or 4 different people there, and but it's August. Don't expect to be doing anything in October with this year's, to have that paperwork done. It's about a good year is a good investment of time from the start to getting it through both sides, administrative stuff. And if there's 3 or 4 partners on a participating agreement or something like that, with say some shared boundary and things that's going on, that just adds to it, because then you got 4 different organizations that their folks are going to want to look at it, their G&A folks and their administrative folks. So the program managers, let's get dirty and get some work done, folks. A lot of times, yeah, it's just like, what do you mean it's the paperwork, this and that? You got to be patient, and you got to understand that everybody, all the pieces of the puzzle got to fit together if you want it to run smooth. Because the worst thing, like Midori was saying, is you finally got it done, and then you start to implement it, and it's like, oh, I wish we would have thought of that, like an inclement weather plan for these students that are still camping these fuels crews that are still camping out, and there's 2 feet of snow on the ground, because that's what their agency said we can't. Cool. That's very cost productive right there for everybody until it snows or there's a hurricane or it's the middle of August in Louisiana. You don't want to be any one of those places, because it's not good. It's not good living conditions. So making sure that those type of things are covered, or understanding how to make adjustments on the fly too, which we can do. We can do modifications, but you got to give it time in any of these processes, and everybody's got to be graceful with this, with each other, and because it does get really confusing and really kind of frustrating when you want to get something done, like, hey, we got to get there. Don't put yourself in that corner. Stay ahead of the ball. Don't be afraid to just kind of, well, like, we're not going to get there. I'd rather get there right than get there in a hurry, and meet a deadline. So that's, and there'll always be another new program too. So if, CWRRP or whatever acronym comes flying out of wherever, there'll be, if you miss that one, there'll be another one. Because there always is, right, Nick? I mean, yeah, it's just like, how many have you seen? And we adjust, and we keep the ball rolling. So that's just the big thing, is always trying to keep the eye on the prize and everybody work together in the same direction. But yeah, we might have to use different tools every time. Might have to switch from standard to metric, or we're somewhere in between, but we're doing it. So that's, I guess, yeah, stay ahead of it if you can.
If I could just piggyback on Mike's comments, really agree. And from the NGO perspective, or at least from our experience, we've had some agreements that have come into place after literally years of conversation, a couple of years easily, and yet also a reality that we're sometimes confronted by is changes in staffing, and you get a new person in a Forest Service position that's really enthusiastic, really excited, and we've literally had calls where it's like, "Hey, I've got $40,000 in funding in 4 days to get this in. Can you work with us?" And it's both, it's a double-edged sword, and it's an outcome of having developed relationships and performed on past projects and having increased capacity. But it's also burned us a little bit in the sense that, as in that particular example, as we work to pushing a proposal or an agreement to the finish line, we learned that our indirect rate had been sacrificed and moved over into the match column. And it was a few $1,000s. It wasn't the end of the world, but I think another lesson learned from our perspective is don't assume that every program manager has the same level of understanding about grants and agreements and budgets working with partners.
I'd love to piggyback on that a little more and just sort of add, and those are such great points. And I think it all points back to, whether you're in the agency or as an NGO leader, like this early engagement with grants and agreements staff who have their own seat and set of expertise and look across lots of different agreements with lots of different organizations and management units, is unlikely that your program manager at a unit level has that level of depth of expertise and understanding of the diversity of ways you could get things done, and or an understanding of your needs, as a nonprofit leader or partner, in a leadership position, county, tribe, whatever that is, in terms of your bottom line things and how to meet that within an agreement structure. So if you're in a position where you're just talking to program staff and they're talking to the grants and agreement staff, and there's a sort of telephone thing happen where they're having to relay your needs, they might be missing what's important to you. They might not be able to communicate that as well. And you hearing firsthand rather than synthesize information from the grants and agreements people, you're going to increase your IQ much faster in terms of your ability to show up to these conversations, to get what you need out of them, to show up in the way you need to show up. And And that's going to be a huge asset for you. Like the more opportunities you have to have direct conversations with grants and agreement staff, the more you're going to be a sophisticated sort of partner showing up to the conversations. As that local program staff cycles, there's a lot more consistency between what G&A staff, even if it's a new person, they're kind of applying the same framework. And so I just can't say enough about that early engagement, bringing in G&A staff in the conversation and taking that as an opportunity for you to become, an expert in your own right, so that you can, and also just that opportunity to advocate for what you need. The G&A person's is the most likely person to come up with the solution that works for everybody. And the program staff, as much as they want to, they probably won't have the expertise, but they may just not even understand and hear what you're saying or your kind of bottom line things. And so just
I'd also say historically, G&A has been the more stable contact because program people do move around for career goals and needs. They retire. Having that base, building that relationship with someone like Gina, who's a partnership coordinator, so she can help you find that program person to step in and help you get your project to the finish line when your primary contact is left or maybe is leaving. It's not uncommon sometimes to have radio silence, is what G&A calls it, where the partner's doing their thing, programs off doing their thing, and they're not really checking in with each other until it's time to do the report or time to do the invoice. And then all of a sudden everybody's surprised. And check in with your people and your contacts, make sure they're still around as you move forward on your projects, especially with a grant. You want to make sure that those people are still around.
Yeah, Emery, if I could, a few things that from this conversation that stood out to me are, setting communication channels like as best you can from the beginning is important so that, because it is a cycle, like Nick was saying and others. And so, having an expectation, and maybe it's like a monthly check-in, so that just like Midori said, those connections are happening on a regular basis. And understanding everyone's annual cycles and schedules is really important. So whether it's the kind of the annual leave time of the calendar or the federal fiscal year or grants and agreements deadlines that kind of are different in each region. So those are all, like, from a partner side, I try to have awareness of those things. I don't have them programmed to my calendar exactly, but I feel like they're just part of like the culture of doing this type of work. And then something that I think Mike brought up a few minutes ago was like, the expectation that it takes a year to get something going, which can be, I think it can be hard to hear that sometimes. You're like, really? It takes a whole year? And my colleague, Gabe Kohler, has this phrase, how many meetings does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? And so how many meetings does it take to get an agreement completed? And I don't know. It's always different, but it always seems like a few more than I thought it was going to take. So just setting those expectations is important, both with others and with yourself. So setting, it's always going to take a little bit more than you think.
Thanks, Eitan. And just another plug to our prior webinars. We had a really good overview of kind of that overall fiscal calendar and what it means for different processes that the Forest Service needs to go through is in that first session. So I think we're going to transition now to our question and answer session. That was a really great discussion. Thanks for just making it flow so well, y'all. We have a few questions coming in. One has already been answered, but it's something that we got a couple registration questions on as well. It's just the topic of match, and it's been mentioned here, so I did want to return to it. The question, it was kind of a two-parter. One question about just a little bit more clarification around the Forest Service's 2022 match reduction, match waiver policy. Midori, let me know if you can speak to that. Otherwise, I have the official guidance teed up and can plug that into the chat and reference that. But the question is just wanting to get clarity on what that match guidance is, or that match reduction and match waiver guidance is, who it applies to, or and kind of how people go about pursuing that or seeing if that applies to their agreements. So that's one question. The other question is, what are ways that folks, strategies to help mitigate or find large match sources? And the specific context is this nonprofit can have trouble providing match for larger agreements where we're assisting with restoration efforts that have a lot of subcontracting components. So I'll kick it to Midori as our resident grants and agreements expert to that match reduction and waiver question. And then if folks want to jump in on just match ideas, questions, or solutions, that would be great.
So the match policy, it would be good for you to load that for them because it is very specific to the agreement side of the house. And so I don't technically deal with that very much in state and private tribal forestry. We have our own match reduction policy that we follow here, which is slightly different than what's in that letter. From my understanding of it though, it's very much on a case-by-case basis. And I wouldn't say need per se, but there needs to be a really strong communication. And part of the issue is around match is people immediately think it means dollar for dollar. So if we give $1, you've got to match it with a hard dollar. As Gina said earlier, match can be so many other things, but they should be specific to the project activity that's happening, whether that's volunteer services, cars that you might be using to transport your students, or even Forest Service employees. In the case of what Gina was talking about, it sounded like they have a shortage of vehicles at the forest, so and the partners might be helping them out some here and there. But that match can be other things, other hours, other time, other sources. It does not necessarily always need to be $1. And so that negotiation is something that needs to happen. And I would involve grants and agreements early on if match is an issue, because grants and agreements can be, program does not always understand. This is one of those details where they don't think outside the box. Typically, they think dollar to dollar. And you need someone who's going, well, can you do this? Can you do that? What are you doing? You know, how many students are you bringing in to do this field work? Their hours can count. So, yeah, bring someone in for that match discussion. Gina, do you have more? Because as a partnership coordinator, I think you probably have more questions for that.
Yeah, Midori, most of the questions when it comes to match for us with partners have been solved at a higher level at the Washington office level. And so the only thing I would add to that is don't take no for an answer until you hear it from a grants and agreements person, because program people are very used to the 20% match requirement and it not being flexible. So so don't believe anyone that's not grants and agreements. Anyway, do a really good job of documenting the value that you're bringing, because there is, I don't even mean to say room for creativity, but there are ways to value things. For instance, your social media reach. On our forest, we don't do a great job of recruiting diverse employees, and our partners do a much better job. So, you know, there's value to those things. Quantifying those is not straightforward, but don't just believe someone who says we can't do it.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm working through 3 of those right now off the national Keystone agreements with TNC and some other folks. And the one of the big things is have some really good map makers, because all of these grants and agreements, especially for fuels projects or for anything that has prescribed fire, a lot of the implementation type projects where you're actually producing change on a landscape requires pretty good mapping skills. So we're talking about the normal things like the vegetation components and the change that you want to make, where the project's going to happen spatially on the landscape, on and off forest, on what land, what ownerships, but also like the equity and inclusion, the communities for social justice type mapping that identifies the counties that are recognized in that. That's a requirement. Things like that that come up. But all of the agreements are going to require some pretty good maps compared to where we were, say, 15, 20 years ago, what they required for maps, which was nothing really. I mean, a lot of times it's just like, yeah, okay, it's a great idea. Let's do this. Now it's very specific, and the accountability part of it's very specific too. So it's a lot like working with the CFLRP or the Joint Chiefs proposals that a lot of our NGOs and adjacent land owners are part of those larger projects. But your watershed map, like make sure you know how to map out the HUCs, the hydrologic units components there. So, or can't remember what HUC stands for, but I know there's different levels of what's a HUC. Come on, somebody. But it's really important if you're using widen, and widen is how we do a lot of cross boundary. So you got to have your maps in order and all your other like documentation. So when you're working on this, especially with new partners and things, make sure your lawyers on both sides look at it and make sure that the labor components are taken care of and things depending on the organization. But those are things that have hung me up in the past and made us miss deadlines. Like, well, we're just going to have to wait till next year and hope we get the money again, kind of thing. And I hate doing that. So, but the mapping has really become really important. So I just want to throw that in there.
I wanted to add another piece to this on the sort of the match side and just kind of creativity and framing on agreements, sort of like what box you paint around your agreement can really change what your matching potential is. And Midori talked about how it can look a lot of different ways, and there's the ability to kind of creatively classify lots of things as match. But when you think about the specific example, the question was around landscape agreements, contractors. Well, now you're at landscape scale, so you got a lot of private landowners. You probably have private operators working. You've got a wide range of partners, maybe hitting on other parts of the landscape, spending money. Maybe it's state money. Maybe it's just private parties doing what they do on their own land. And now that wraps into this landscape vision. And so if your agreement, master agreement, standalone agreement, whatever, is framed around the partnership scale, maybe you're the only party to that agreement, but the work of the agreement is what everyone's doing, within that landscape now. And now the ability to match changes fundamentally, because it doesn't have to be money running through your shop, right? It has to be money achieving the impact that the agreement's meant to achieve. And so if it's a landscape scale thing with lots of parties kind of contributing to the outcomes and you framed it in that way, maybe your partners funding that they're not leveraging through a financial instrument with the feds, now that's available for match because they haven't matched it somewhere else. And so you can build that into your financial plan and it can be the match. And so when you have these high match thresholds, say when you're using a lot of private contractors where the threshold goes up a little, well, now maybe you've thought outside, maybe you've created a big enough box so that thinking outside the box actually works for your match needs. Anyway.
So Nick, the only thing I wanted to add, so I'm glad you brought up that some of those other sources might be federal sources. If it's a state source, you probably want to check and make sure that that funding coming through the state didn't come from a federal grant, because sometimes that funding doesn't lose its federal flavor coming through a state. So you just want to know what's the source, because Fed to Fed usually can't happen. There are a few agencies that are allowed to have their funds used as match, but they're very few and far between. And most of that work wouldn't happen on forest. I wouldn't say never, because National Art Endowment might come out and do something.
I guess I'll weigh in that I appreciate this conversation, and in some respects it feels like, we're still building the plane while we're flying, and match is a piece of that. And at times it feels like there's some kind of mental or math gymnastics that are happening, and the sophistication of a system that can track, match, and make sure it's that original flavor, to your point, Midori, or that it's not being double counted, isn't occurring. And speaking more, almost more philosophically, I mean, I think one of the most important things we can do is perform on any project we take on for our community and through these partnerships. And then there's that whole legality piece that Midori spoke to, absolutely critical. In terms of match, it is challenging for us. I mean, we've been fortunate enough to have some robust state level investments that we can use, that are state sourced funds from the Washington State Legislature, that we're able to use as match. Our work through the collaborative group, we track all those volunteer hours when you have 30 people show up for a meeting or for a field trip. But sometimes those program level conversations often start with, hey, could you actually provide us a couple of bodies, some boots on the ground to support a Forest Service project. So we're effectively providing an employment resource to our Forest Service partner. And when we start talking about match, sometimes the comment seems to be like, oh, don't worry a whole lot about it. Yeah, we got to show that 20%, but this conversation right here counts. And at the end of the day, I would say as a third incredibly valuable thing is that our organizations as partners, or whether it's local governments, that we stay whole, right? And there is a cost to doing business, and whether it's what you're asked to do match wise, or whether it's your indirect rate, if we're giving up a few percent here and there and everywhere, and it starts to add up, it has that potential to be kind of like a death of a million paper cuts kind of thing. And that's not doing anybody any good in terms of our ability to sustain a partnership and to continue to do good work on the ground.
Thanks, Jay, for bringing it out to that higher level. We have a couple follow-up questions that maybe if one person could briefly weigh in on, about just asking kind of putting forward the fact that some people have received pushback on going directly to grants and agreements. In some regions, they may have different direction on that. Or grants and agreements, people are equally overloaded, plates super full, and asking about, are there different avenues or pathways to, or people that folks should try to get in touch with. Does someone want to take that? And then I want to make sure we kind of get to a few other questions.
Yeah, well, I'll start. When I, years ago, there would be a grants and agreements person at a forest or zoned for a few forests, and you develop relationships with them. In the region where I primarily work, Region 3. Now it's different. It's kind of everyone works across the whole region, and so I've adapted to that. And I let in my communications with the program people that I'm working on for this, we discuss, is this a moment to try to schedule a time to meet with the grants and agreements person who's assigned to this, and then it goes through that channel. So I saw that in the chat or in the Q&A, and I was thinking how, yeah, you may be encouraged not to reach out to that person directly, but through your programmatic partner, you should be able to set something up to discuss the issue.
Emery, I'll chime in. So the Salmon Chalice is in Intermountain Region 4, and because there's so many new grants and agreements people, they've had a pretty robust training program. So lots of great webinars that partnership coordinators and program staff can join. And so one of the things we've talked about is having those same kinds of trainings available for our external partners. And I would suggest, if you are in the nonprofit community, ask for that kind of opportunity. I think that would really help us, first, some consistency among all of our grants and agreements specialists, as well as nonprofit partners hearing the same information. So it's something that I know we've got in the works, and I think it's a great idea. And it really does matter when you're the ones asking for that.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all. Well, wanted to shift gears to one of the first questions we received, which was asking about blanket purchase agreements. Can someone dive into what are they and how or if they're relevant to this grants and agreements context, and how maybe nonprofit partners have worked with these mechanisms?
I can take a stab at it. So blanket purchase agreements, imagine them as not being agreements in the grants and agreements context. They're essentially it's a contracting mechanism, so a competitive contracting mechanism, a lot like what the Forest Service used historically in what are called IDIQ contracts, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. So essentially, and those are usually large region or even multi-region agreements where the agency asks for submissions of qualifications and costs for a different range of activities that they might eventually issue contracts for. You as a private nonprofit organization, you can get into that, and then they create a pool of qualified contractors, and then any new contracting opportunity gets issued as a competed item for just that pool. So you have to get in the pool. You have to get in the BPA pool. And this has been really accelerated, this use of this tool under Bill and Ira, and they're more forest level a lot of times, or maybe like 3-4 forests. But it's really a contracting pool. So if you have a set of capabilities that's responsive to the BPA, you put together a proposal, you get in the pool, and then you're pre-qualified to compete for contracting opportunities. And it's not cost recovery like grants and agreements. You can build in for profit, you can build in risk into your bids when those contract opportunities come up. You'll be treated just like a private contractor. And so the relationship with the forest on the administration side, on the financial side, looks pretty different. But again, you can take profit, and you could, yeah. So that's the gist of it. Imagine it as a contracting mechanism. It's competitive. It includes more than cost recovery, so you can build in, profit margins, and you're competing against whoever else from the private sector. Again, it could be not for profit or for profit, is already in that pool.
Thanks, Nick. Are there certain kind of circumstances where that's really the option you would go for versus an agreement, for example, when pursuing a particular project, or is that a relevant decision?
I guess I'll just say at the unit level, your relationship with the management unit you're working, the forest, the districts, whatever, like they're going to look at their whole pool of funding every year, and they're going to say, how am I going to get this work done? What can we do with this money? And when the money comes in the door at the region and then down to the forests, like it doesn't say you have to use this for contracts or you have to use this for agreements, right? There's a lot of discretion at the unit level. And so you thinking about how you're positioned with with the unit, your own capabilities, where you're trying to go together. You're having conversations about with your unit staff, whether it's line officers, program people, about what you want to do together, how much agreement money you could onboard, what your capabilities are. And then, in all likelihood, you might aspire to more than the unit wants to run through cooperative agreements. They're probably going to run the rest of that through some other competitive contract structures. Are you well positioned to pick up that additional work within a BPA? Is it worth your time and energy to get in a proposal and be in that pool? Do you think you can be competitive in that pool with private consultants? Do you want to have relationships with some of the private firms that might pick up that work as a prime contractor where you could be a sub to them? How does contracting fit in your portfolio? And then how are you showing up with the unit to sort of express your aspirations and make sure enough's flowing through agreements, non-competitive agreements, that you're meeting your objectives? And then if you have that margin to look at contracting as well as a strategy for how you do business with the feds, just thinking about how you're positioning yourself in that, what your capabilities are, how it fits in your whole portfolio of sort of capacity and work and, mission.
Yeah, I guess
So-
another consideration on that too is thinking about we may not be able to contract with you directly, but if we have a good neighbor, a GNA, a good neighbor authority project happening right now, or something like that the state is running, or TNC is running, or something like that, you can contract with them with the funding from that side of that agreement, because of different, and there's tons of different reasons why things might not work, why the pieces won't fit together. But then there's always like hey, well, maybe we can try this, and this will work. This will still get everybody working, getting the work done. It's just not maybe the same flavor of that you were thinking you were going to add this spice to it. It's like, well, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to use some of this instead, and it's still going to work. It's still going to give it that kick. So, yeah, you got to be creative sometimes. But I was thinking of a couple examples like that where it's like we tried to do BPAs or an IDIQ with a cooperator, and we wound up just going through the GNA and using that agency who was doing the GNA to actually utilize the cooperator.
So one of the things I just want to, because both Nick and Mike, what they're talking about is contracts, and just because a blanket purchase order agreement uses the word agreement doesn't mean it's an agreement. So in this case, they're right, it's a contract, which means I absolutely know nothing about them. And yeah, if there's a stewardship agreement or a good neighbor agreement with a state agency or the Nature Conservancy or someone, a bigger partner, they might have that contract in place and pay through the agreement. So knowing who the partners are would be a good thing.
I've got to add this one more piece because it links back up to something Jay said. Jay was talking about as a nonprofit, how are you actually covering your cost of doing business, your indirect costs? And it can be really hard, and especially when you're matching part of your indirect to sort of meet match requirements sometimes. So you're sort of shortchanging yourself maybe within project to sort of make it work, right? And to keep doing your mission work. But how are you picking up the rest of that? And so it could be through private donations, and philanthropy, certainly, but, unrestricted income is something you can generate through contracts. And so having a piece of your strategy include, fee for service contracting, whether you're as a sub to another, qualified consulting group or operator, or whether you're trying to do it yourself, exploring this as one line of how you get your business done. We're doing identical work with one national forest under a BPA. We're getting paid a certain rate as we do under a cooperative agreement where we just do cost recovery and we have matching requirements. And so, yeah, just strategy kind of consideration.
I just want to jump in. If your head is spinning on all of this stuff, we as community navigators, that's kind of our role, is to help people just kind of think about different options to, again, partner, pursue different funding avenues with the agency. And we have relationships, obviously, with the Watershed Center and with the Forest Stewards Guild to help provide that sort of assistance with this amazing well of institutional knowledge. So do not feel like you have to know all of this. These are people with decades of experience in this work and can be here to help folks kind of walk along that path a little bit more. So we have about 5 minutes. One question that we got was asking about management of volunteers by a cooperator, and if people have ideas around how that has worked in your context. So the context of the question is, someone is working with a cooperator organization that manages volunteers. The cooperator and the local ranger district are interested in setting up a mutual benefit agreement using this Forest Service manual provision covering the management of volunteers. So wondering if maybe just in general, if you all know of examples of management of volunteers by a cooperator and that being enabled through an agreement.
Yeah, this question stumped me a bit. But I think, there's some things with volunteers that are important to consider. They're like, and it's like, I guess from a risk management perspective, if people are volunteering, like physically doing something, I'm not talking about like contributing to a meeting or a project, like actually like doing something outdoors, which is the sense I got here from this question. I think making sure that the volunteers are not going to have a life-changing incident happen through the course of their volunteering without any backstop. And I think that's an important thing for all of us to think about. I think there's different ways that could be covered. And I am not the best person to dive deeper into that, but I do know that like when we are working with volunteers, sometimes we've had people volunteering on prescribed burns, which is a big ask, and in other types of trainings outdoors that have risk, it's a real careful moment, and you want to make sure that there is some backstop there so that they can walk away from the training and carry about their lives in a positive way.
Yeah, I know that each agency I've worked for, I think that's 4 or 5 now, has had a process to easily and simply and quickly have somebody fill out a form on the truck hood kind of thing and sign it, a volunteer service agreement for that activity. And now I don't know nowadays, I haven't had to do that. I haven't had a truck hood in a while either. But I've had to do that with every agency I've worked with because even if they were volunteers with the other group, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission or something, and they wanted to come work on this joint project on the refuge catching alligators. Well, we went ahead and had them sign our volunteer agreement, so that's the agreement we had with that person at that time now. So I'm not sure where those are now, but that's between an individual and the agency when they sign those. So I'm not sure, but that was the process we used. I had to use a lot of times to get people, and sometimes I'd have 15 people standing there waiting to plant pine trees for me, but they weren't getting away from me and even though we were planting pine trees, who knows what could happen out there? Bee stings, snags, limbs, whatever. A lot of things happen out there that you might not expect in the day. So definitely have something in place and know who's working out there.
Yeah. I would say when it comes to volunteers, if the forest doesn't have a volunteer coordinator, then the region should have a volunteer coordinator. And you probably want to make sure you have the latest information about that Forest Service agreement and the liability, and then also talk to GNA, because sometimes if that person signs that Forest Service agreement, their hours then count to the Forest Service, and they're no longer a part of your match because they're not your hours. They're now federal in the count. You have to pay attention to that. I would also advise asking that the safety people on the forest be closely involved with any activity, and that they do safety briefs and maybe make sure everyone's trained for whatever the activity is, so that people are aware of the risk and aren't going out and doing something they're not prepared for. We never want someone to go out in the woods and get hurt at all, whether they're a volunteer or a contractor or a cooperator or partner or a federal agent, employee.
Yeah.
Safety.
I'm gonna have to leave it there. We're at the top of the hour. We did have one question in the Q&A box, Midori, if you know about anticipated changes to uniform guidance revisions this year, if you want to answer that in the Q&A box while I finish.
I can answer it really quickly, even though we're at the top of the hour. The United States Department of Agriculture will accept the changes in the 2 CFR 200 starting October 1st. And so that flows down to the Forest Service because we're underneath the Department of Ag. And so any of those changes that are in the Federal Register or anything like that, they will happen October 1st. So there'll be more information coming out about that from the agency standpoint. So
Great, and we'll try to get some more information into our follow-up email about that. Just to wrap things up, I'm gonna share my screen in a moment with just some final wrap-up resources, but just a big thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a really awesome discussion that I think ties together, again, a lot of threads from our other webinars. So thank you, and hope everyone learned a lot, and thank you all for coming. So I'm gonna share my screen quickly with a few final resources. We do have our Community Navigator initiative, again, for folks that are interested in connecting with a navigator, signing up for our newsletter, etc. And then another plug for our Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network for anyone interested or working in all aspects of community wildfire adaptation and resilience. That's a great place to connect with other members, access a lot of different learning opportunities and other resources. So those are the two websites for those organizations and initiatives. And again, thank you all for coming. And this recording will be available in the coming week. So a big thanks to our panelists as well, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Sarah, thanks.
Thank you.